What is up, everyone? Team Andoer here, and tonight we will be talking about how you could slow your footage down over at Premiere Pro. Before we dive into the Premiere Pro software, there's an important aspect we have to talk about before we continue on. So it is frame rates. So frame rates, there are common frame rates that we get to see that a camera has. So it's 24 FPS, 30 FPS, 60 FPS, and 120 FPS. So let's discuss each really quickly because this could be another video altogether. So first is 24 FPS. 24 FPS, we usually use this for talking head sequences like this one. I'm talking to you in 24 FPS. And a little background on 24 FPS. 24 FPS is usually what you see on Hollywood movies. It's what you see on TV. Everything is filmed on 24 FPS. That is on some regions, they use 24 FPS, but in some European countries, I think like in Japan, they use 30 FPS. So what is the difference? 30 FPS is just a bit smoother than the 24 FPS because there is that extra 6 frames per second that your camera is taking to stitch it up into a video. So it's gonna look smoother. It's not, for me at least, my opinion, it's not gonna look as cinematic as you would like, as I would like. But yeah, I sometimes use it as well. But next is the 60 and 120. The reason that I bucketed them together is because they are for supporting shots or for like the artistic shots, to speed ramp shots. So it's usually the shots you slow down over at your editing software. And this is coming from the context that you are editing on a 24 FPS sequence or timeline at Premiere Pro. So I personally edit at 24p. That's my workflow. But the reason is at 24p, that's why you can slow down 60 and 120, is because they have more frames in between them. So when you slow a clip down, it usually expands. So it can accommodate those spaces in between when you slow it down to make it look smooth. As compared to the 24 FPS, you can't really make it look smoother because there's no extra frames, especially I'm editing on a 24 FPS timeline, because when you edit on a slower timeline like maybe 12 or whatever, it's gonna look a bit stop motiony. How do you slow it down? When you edit on a 24 FPS sequence, the 30 FPS, you can slow it down at around 80%. 24 divided by 30 is 0.8. And 24 divided by 60 is 0.4. So you can slow down that footage that you shot with 60 frames per second. You can slow it down up to 40%, as low as 40%. And for the 120p, it slows down as much as 20% because 20% of 120 is 24. So there's the math for you. So generally, you shoot talking heads with 24 FPS because it's gonna look more cinematic. The motion blur is gonna look more natural. Just to touch on a bit to make your footage a bit smoother is what is the shutter speed, no? So 24p, 24 FPS. When you shoot at 24 FPS, general rule of thumb is you shoot at double the shutter speed. So right now I'm shooting at 24 FPS. My shutter speed is at 50 because there's no 48 shutter speed on my 1/48 shutter speed on my camera. So I'm shooting at 1/50th, 1/50th of a second. When you shoot 60 FPS, make sure you are shooting at 1/125th of a second because there's no 120. And for 120 FPS, you shoot at 240, or in my case, I shoot at around 250, 1/250th of a second to make the motion blur more natural. So usually you double the shutter speed depending on your frame rate. So I'm gonna show you a sample when you slow down these clips. So I'm just gonna put them together here side by side. So as you can see, the 24 FPS video was really jittery. I slowed them all down at the maximum. So But for the 24 FPS, I slowed it down by 50%. So as you can see, it's jittery. The 30 FPS doesn't really look much different than what this looks like because it's only slowed down to 20%. And the 60 and 120 is slowed down by 40 and 20% respectively. So let's dive into Premiere Pro so we can find out, or I can teach you, I can show you guys how you could slow down your footage on Premiere Pro, and as well I can show you guys how to set up your 24 FPS sequence or timeline over at Premiere Pro. So let's jump on it. Alright, so first I will show you how to make a 24p sequence. So on the Mac, you just hit on Command N, then you'll get this window. And then I already have a 24p sequence here that I use all the time in making my YouTube videos and other B-roll videos. And here you go. So make sure that your editing mode is just custom. It's gonna change anyway. So make sure that your time base is 23.976. I use 23.976 because on my camera it's 23.976. It's not exactly 60p. It's not 60 FPS, and 60 FPS is not actually exactly 60 FPS. It's around 59.94 or 59.90 something. So that's good. You just, depending on what camera you have or what settings are you have in your camera, you use that. Make sure it matches. So for me, it's 23.976. I usually just shoot in 1080p. So here's my frame size, 920 by 1080. Change it by, depending on what your camera is. If you're shooting 4K or 720, just make sure the frame size is the equivalent of whatever frame size you are shooting on. Alright, so you'll just leave the rest of this. You can take a screenshot. I'll give you a second to take a screenshot. Alright, so there you go, and just rename your sequence. This is a slow motion sample. Alright, so there you go. You already have your 24 FPS timeline here ready to start editing. Okay, so I have a couple of clips that I have ready. I'm just gonna pull them out. Alright, now that you have your clips over here, you can see the frame rate here. So one is at 23 frames per second. This one is 23 frames per second. 30 frames per second. I have to no, actually the slow motion one, the 120p, shows up as 29.97. Again, I don't know why, but it's regardless. Let's start with the 24 FPS. So for the 24 FPS, quite simply, you just drag it. Alright, so like what I showed you earlier, when you try to slow that down, so let's go to speed and duration, and you try to slow it down just 90% speed, it's gonna look a bit jittery. So if you slow it down further, like here, speed and duration, let's try to slow it down 50%. It's not gonna look as smooth as you want it to look. So see, look at that, it's so jittery, it's laggy. So that's not a good look when you're making a video. So let's start with the 60. So again, right click on the file, modify, interpret footage, and then just type in your sequence 23.976. Drag it over to your timeline, keep existing settings, and then you can see it's smoother. It has a smoother movement to it. It feels more cinematic. The slow motion feels more cinematic because there are no jitters. Alright, so that's one way, and then let's just go back here. It's 59.94 again. Drag it over there, and then what you do is you right click on that, and then speed and duration, and then the lowest you can go for 60 fps is 40%, because again 24 is 40% of 60 fps. So just click OK, and you get the same result. So those are two ways for me, depending on what I'm editing, but generally I just use the interpret footage here. It's quicker for me because I'm not gonna shoot 59 or 60 fps if I'm not gonna slow it down anyway. So better to slow down all the clips at the same time. So for the 120p, if you play this back, it's already gonna be in slow motion, because I think that's what happens when you shoot 120 in the EOS R. So what you do is, again, you right click. It's basically the same that I'm gonna show you anyway, and then modify, interpret footage, and then just enter your sequence into 3.976, and then you drag it into your timeline. See how much longer that is. Let's see. So my camera only shoots 120p at 720, so it's smaller. So a quick hack or a quick tip on how you make it the same size quicker is you just right click the footage and then set to frame size, and then there you go. So as you can see, it's slower, so much slower. It's nicer. There's no jitters. So there you have it. Just a quick recap. 24 fps. You can't slow it down. On the method that I showed you, because maybe you can slow it down. You could use optical flow, but that's a topic for another video. It's another topic altogether, and it's still not going to look as good because the system is going to be cheating. So if you want to slow things down to get better b-roll shots, make sure you're shooting at 60 fps and 120 fps, where some cameras go up to 240 fps like the Fuji X-T4. But yeah, generally I shoot my talking heads at 24 fps, and I shoot my slow-mo b-roll shots at 60 or 120. And just to wrap things up, I know it's going to be difficult when you're shooting a project and you're only using one camera. You're gonna have to switch between 24 and 60 and 120. So what I did, I had the project like last year, where I had to do an interview and I had to do b-roll shots as well. I only had one camera. Is that I finished all the talking head parts first. So I finished all the interview material first, and then from that interview I found out on what to shoot during the b-roll sequences that I was gonna show, so it would make more sense. So another tip is to write down your shots. I'm guilty of not writing down my shots, so that's something I really have to improve on as well. It's a tip to myself as well. But yeah, in general, you could just do, and you can just practice. Make sure you have your frame rates on lock, just make cool videos. Let's learn together, let's grow together, let's figure out things together. So having said that, that's it for me tonight. If you feel like you learned something, please hit the like button, give me a thumbs up, will help the channel a lot. If you like this kind of content and you feel like you learned something, please subscribe, hit the bell so you're notified every time I have a new video. And that's it for me. Peace.